What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel, and in today's video we're going to be continuing on with my series of reviews on the Alien franchise as we talk about probably the most hated film in the franchise, and I'm very curious to hear what your guys' opinions on this one is. And this film is called Alien Resurrection. Let's take a trip back to 1997 for a film directed by Jean-Pierre Jeunet and written by Joss Whedon and stars people like Sigourney Weaver, Winona Ryder, Ron Perlman, Gary Dourdan, Brad Dourif, and many more. So it's been a good few weeks since we talked about an Alien film, but I still want to hold myself to that promise I made to you guys that I'll get through all of the Alien films at least before we get to Alien Romulus that comes out in just a little bit of time at this point. We're not too far away from that film. I'm looking forward to checking out Alien Romulus. It's exciting to know that we're getting back to the basics based on the trailers with a new horror installment in the franchise. So yeah, after this we have Prometheus as well as Alien Covenant, and then there's also the Alien vs Predator films, but I do plan on covering the Predator films before I do those, so those might come a little bit after Alien Romulus, but I still do plan to get those done within the coming months. But here we are now talking about the fourth installment in the franchise, Alien Resurrection, which, to start this off, I mentioned in some of the other videos about some of the nostalgia I have for these films, and this film is no different because I have a specific memory of being over at my aunt and uncle's house when I was a young kid. My whole family was staying over, and there was people sleeping on the couches, some people were sleeping on like the pull-out couch, people on air mattresses around the living room, and I woke up probably around like 3 or 4 in the morning. It was just me who woke up. I think I was sharing a pull-out couch bed with my mom at the time, and I just remember waking up and seeing sequences of this film playing out when I was a young kid, and I was so pulled into what was going on. I hadn't seen the film before. This film came out in 97. I was born in 93. I don't know what year that was that I have that memory of, but I'm gonna assume it was in my fairly younger years. I was both creeped out and intrigued by what was going on, but at the time I hadn't actually sat down to watch the film. And as years went on and I actually finally got to see the Alien films, I always had positive thoughts on this film, but this was long before I started getting really into critical thinking when it came around movies. You know, it was a lot more about me just enjoying the aesthetic and the vibe of the film. And as somebody who's always been a big sci-fi fan, as a kid I used to think this film, like all of the films in the Alien franchise, were super cool. And while there are elements about this film I certainly will praise, and some things I do think are pretty cool about this film, I think it goes without saying that this is probably one of the most hated films in the franchise, and in my opinion for good reason. So without further ado, let's get into what's going on in this film. In the last film, Alien 3, Sigourney Weaver's character Ripley dies. We find out that she has been infected by the creature. She has now been impregnated. There is a xenomorph on the way out of her chest. She sacrifices herself in order for her to not spread the xenomorph virus anymore and chooses to, kill herself. This movie jumps a couple of 100 years into the future. Now we are introduced to a new Sigourney Weaver that is a clone of the original Sigourney Weaver. As the time goes on throughout the course of the film, and I'm moving a little bit forward here in terms of Sigourney Weaver's character, we learn that she is a creation that was not only made of just the DNA of Sigourney Weaver's character Ripley, but also of the aliens, of the xenomorphs. We end up learning at a certain point in the film, when she actually discovers a room, that there are other versions of Sigourney Weaver clones that they tried to create, some of which came out to be abominations, with her being the most human-like, the most Ripley-like out of the bunch. We learned that in the latter half of the film, but I am going to be bouncing around. This won't be a play-by-play of everything that happens in the film, but I am going to just talk about the general topics that we see in this film. But when we're first introduced to Ripley, we realize something is off about her, and right out of the gate, this is a really strange decision to make. To jump a couple of 100 years into the future after the hero of the last film sacrificed herself, even though I don't love a lot of what they did in that third film, and you guys can go back and check out my review to hear more in detailed thoughts into that. But even though I didn't love what they did with her in that film, I at least appreciated that she sacrificed herself in the end, that there was, her main objective was to get rid of the xenomorph and to not let that, get into the hands of other people who would want to study it. Ultimately, for us to jump into this film, for her to be created as a clone hybrid, and for us to learn that the exact thing she was trying to avoid is exactly what happens. The ship that she's on, this clone, is actually being run by a bunch of scientists that, as you would expect it, have a bunch of xenomorphs and are using them for experimental experimental purposes. Some of these scientists that we get to see here are played by people like J.E. Freeman, as well as Brad Dourif, who I always love seeing in anything, even if it's not a good movie. Of course, Brad Dourif plays Chucky. I'm a ginormous Chucky fan. If you guys have been following his channel, you know that. And so it's always nice to see Brad Dourif, especially in his younger years in something like this, especially with a weird little sci-fi ponytail of the 90s. Very much in a lot of ways, the sci-fi element to this film very much feel like 90s sci-fi. And so, yeah, you have all these scientists now that are experimenting on all of these xenomorphs. They're using their eggs and actually, forcefully impregnating people without them knowing what's going on in order for them to just kind of see what the process is of creating these xenomorphs and just keeping an eye on them. And amidst some of this first stuff of seeing them experiment on these xenomorphs is where some of my first positive thoughts on the film come out, which is with the practical effects. Something I have praised this franchise for the very beginning is the practical effect makeup work, costume design, as well as the various puppeteering that's done to bring these xenomorphs to life. I've said it before, but the xenomorph for me is one of the coolest monster designs in any movie, and for a big period of time, when you thought of alien movies, the xenomorph was the creature design that you thought about, and I think there's no difference here. The look and feel of the xenomorphs throughout the course of this film, the practical effects around the xenomorphs are top tier. That's exactly where they spent majority of the money and a lot of the time to make them look realistic and pretty badass. They're a lot more moist and wet in this one, but for the most part, they have a really cool aesthetic to them, and I really thoroughly enjoy all the money and time and detail that went into the practical effects of these xenomorphs in this film. And so, yeah, we got to see them being experimented on. We learned that exactly what Ripley was trying to avoid is what's happening in this film. And not too long into the film, we're introduced to a group of mercenaries that star people like Michael Wincott, Winona Ryder, Ron Perlman, Gary Dourdan, Dominique Pinon, and some others, and we're introduced to the fact that this group of mercenaries are actually going out and finding different people that are on ships that are in cryostasis and bringing them to these scientists. They don't necessarily know what for, but eventually they end up learning that the reason is they're using these people who have been in cryostasis as the unfortunate victims of testing out these various things with impregnating humans with these xenomorphs. As you would come to expect from any alien film, though, not too long to the film, the xenomorphs start to break out and start to kill everybody, including the scientists. The scientists who believe they can contain them and control them are quickly learning that they can't, and the exact thing that Ripley feared in the past is starting to happen. Now you have this spaceship setting its courses to Earth to try to save as much of the scientific data that they have and bring the xenomorph to Earth, while Ripley, the clone, works alongside this group of mercenaries to try to fight off the xenomorphs, as well as try to deter the ship from going to Earth to not have the xenomorphs continue to expand and kill all of humanity on Earth. And that's the base gist of what goes on here throughout the course of the film. Most of it is just them trying to survive with certain characters being killed off, a lot of mistrust. And so the question might be, well, why don't people love this film? And honestly, it really comes down to the dialogue and a lot of the script as a whole. The overall narrative is just strange to me. The decision to even make Ripley a clone after all this time is also strange to me. And Sigourney Weaver's performance, while I do think she commits to it, is pretty strange in this film, because the Ripley of the last 3 films was a human. She was a normal person. Here she's kind of playing this more like alpha robotic, kind of like power hungry kind of Ripley. She's not necessarily overly power hungry, but she's powerful, she's stronger, so she's walking around kind of weird, like she is this strong being, very much like an android or a robotic, except she isn't. And then speaking on androids and robotics, we learn not too long into the film that there is an android in the mix, which is Winona Ryder's character, Cal, who was actually sent there and went with the objective to try to find this Ripley clone, knowing that there was already a Ripley clone, and do what she can to try to make sure that none of these xenomorphs get to Earth. So she had her own objective. Everybody that was a part of this mercenary team did not know that she was also an android. And this kind of ends up making both the Ripley clone and Winona Ryder's character, Cal, kind of the outliers in the group. And through that, they kind of build a bit of a bond where they work together to achieve this goal. All the other humans in the mix, of course, don't want to die. They don't want to necessarily get the xenomorphs to Earth, but they don't necessarily want to crash the ship either. They want to try to survive the situation, whereas Ripley and Cal don't necessarily have the same outlook. They want to do whatever they can to try to destroy these xenomorphs. And on some hands, I can understand why this might seem like a cool idea. You have Joss Whedon, who would go on to direct the Avengers films later on and, do some really cool things with movie and TV, writing the film here. And yeah, I don't think this is necessarily some of his strongest work. And even the director of this film, Jean-Pierre Jeunet, would go on to do his next film in 2001, which was Amélie, which is one of the most popular foreign films of all time. But when you look at what really doesn't work for this film, it is its story and its dialogue, its characters, and in a lot of ways, its cinematography. There are some cool moments of action in this film, but so much of it is so overblown, so over the top, to a level where it just comes off incredibly cringy and cheese. And there is very much that 90s kind of sci-fi vibe to it. It goes without saying that when you look at the 90s, there was tons of great cultural elements when it came down to music and, you know, clothing and movies and all kinds of other things. But it goes without saying as well that there was a huge cringe over the top element to a lot of media that came out in the 90s, and this film is no different. There are so many elements about this film when it comes down to the way that the camera moves and the way it's edited that is just so sporadic and over the top. The lines of dialogue that a lot of the characters are given in the film and the way they choose to fight the Xenomorphs is just cringy and so over the top that makes you just laugh throughout the course of the film. A lot of that coming from Ron Perlman's character, who's meant to be this overly badass dude, and majority of the lines of dialogue that he's given is just laugh-inducing. You can't say anything else other than the fact that there are lines that he's given that are just so ridiculously over the top that it just comes off incredibly cringy. And so much of this film, when it comes down to its story, just makes you feel like, why did they go with that route? And so it's one of those alien films that's kind of tough to fully invest yourself emotionally in, because none of the story really does any kind of benefit to the characters and the character development. There isn't really a great sense of tension or stakes. You never necessarily feel a sense of fear for the characters, and most of the characters are really obnoxious, over the top, and silly a lot of the times, and so you don't really care when anybody starts to get picked off throughout the course of the film. Though if I had to give some flowers to some of the cast, I do think that while Ron Perlman is given horrible lines of dialogue, I appreciate his commitment to this ridiculously over the top, oftentimes incredibly sexist character that I think he really does play well. I think he's the perfect actor for a really over the top 90s performance like this, though I don't necessarily like what they did with his character on the writing level. Outside of him, the biggest kind of praise I can give when it comes down to the cast is Sigourney Weaver and Winona Ryder. I think the two of them do a solid job with the performances and as far as what they're given on paper, but ultimately I do think, like everything else in this film, when it comes down to the script, they aren't really done a lot of favors as actors. And it's crazy because Sigourney Weaver was producing this film as well. You can tell that she probably thought, well, this would be great for my career to continue on with Alien, but I ultimately think it kind of does the opposite, where I think that bringing Ripley back as this alien hybrid clone in this film ultimately just kind of worked against Ripley and made her a bit of a more cringe character in this film in comparison to her being this character that you can really root for in the first three films. While I don't like how they start off the third film, and I don't necessarily like a lot of the decisions they make on a writing level when it comes to Ripley in that third film, I think that she's still giving a good performance as this character who is badass and willing to fight alongside people to save humanity. Whereas in this film, she's given this weird alien-like robotic performance that I understand what the approach was, but it just comes off cheesy and in all the wrong ways. Winona Ryder, while she is an android, I think does the best job here at just kind of seeming like somebody who, you know, is giving a solid performance throughout the course of the film. But unfortunately as well, based on the other performances we've seen of androids in this franchise, hers is the least robotic, oftentimes just feeling like another human in the mix and not really having anything that distinctly makes her an android in any way, shape, or form. And of course, as we get to the end of this video, we have to talk about the newborn, because it's one of the most iconic elements of this film and was something that I always had a lot of nostalgia for in this film. Of course, I already mentioned earlier when we first started talking about Ripley that eventually she finds a room where there's a bunch of various versions of her that were failures. A bunch of versions of her that were supposed to be created, including one that was alive and was just this big alien human hybrid that she eventually chooses to kill and destroy all of the other experimented versions of clones of hers that never came to be. Not too much longer after that though, Ripley ends up getting taken away by a bunch of Xenomorphs and ends up getting taken to the Queen. We get to see the Queen again for the first time since the second film, and we end up learning that the Queen is using Ripley's kind of clone alien DNA to now create something called the newborn, which was a pure human and Xenomorph hybrid that ends up coming out of the belly of the Queen. This creature ends up instantly turning around and killing its mother, the Queen, and goes over to Ripley and now believes Ripley is its mother. And so it has this kind of human vibe to it in terms of how its eyes move and how it looks, and I really like the animatronic here. I will say that the practical effects to bring the newborn Xenomorph to life, I think, is pretty great. The character still looks really cool. It's gruesome, it's nasty to look at, while also charming in moments. There are elements about the monster that you can kind of feel for, because it does kind of feel like a newborn. It does feel like this baby that is trying to look for its mother, and when it does have these sequences where it's connecting with Sigourney Weaver's character and believing that it is its mother, there are some elements when it comes down to the way that they kind of animate some of the eye movements that makes you feel for the character very slightly. Not too much longer into it though, it starts to kill everything else that isn't Sigourney Weaver. So of course Sigourney Weaver's Ripley clone must now work to try to get back to the ship where everybody else is, Winona Ryder and the gang, so they can try to escape. Of course the newborn ends up falling behind. They end up having to kill the newborn by sending it out into space in a billion pieces, and then the movie comes to an end as they were of course able to move away from Earth and save Earth and destroy the rest of the Xenomorphs on board, and then they save the day. That's pretty much how the whole movie goes, and what I can say about this movie, as I've already said, is that I think it's a movie that has really solid practical effects. I think the set design is great. There's some great costume design as well. There are some fun ideas in here, but ultimately this is a film that just also has way more bad ideas than good. The overall script and dialogue is just cheesy in all the wrong ways. The choices they made with Ripley, I think, were really poor. I think that they should have just moved on to having a new character in the mix here instead of focusing on this clone of hers several hundred years later. And I just think that at the end of the day, when it comes down to this one comparatively to the other ones, the story is a mess. The character design or the character development is just completely non-existent. The lines of dialogue are incredibly cheesy, and there really isn't anything on a narrative level or a music level that ever makes this one really stand out. I thought the third film was a bit of a messy one when I went back and revisited it, but honestly this one makes it kind of look like a masterpiece. But when you look at the first 4 Alien films, it is really unfortunate that you have first 2 films that are top tier, that I think are some of the best alien sci-fi films of all time, with the third film being an unfortunate step down, and the fourth film being just absolutely just a mess, just a flat out mess. It doesn't really have much really going for it, and outside of some great practical effects and set design, when it comes down to what you care most about, which is characters and story, you just don't really have much here to really latch onto. So that's gonna be my thoughts on Alien Resurrection. It's been a lot of fun covering the Alien films up to this point. Sorry if I feel a little bit out of it, as you guys know from some of my recent videos where I've talked about it. Been going through some mental health stuff, so I'm taking some medication right now. That's also got me in a little bit of a brain fog, but I want to still be able to do some videos and do the things I love, so I can kind of start to get back to normality. So a big thanks to you guys for watching, and definitely leave some comments down below. Are you guys a fan of Alien Resurrection? Where does this rank for you in the Alien franchise? Whatever the case may be, leave any and all comments down below, and I'll see you beautiful people in the next one. Bye-bye.